Welcome to the campus of the National Hispanic Cultural Center, and I would like to welcome you all to one of our programs in the La Canoa Legacy Talk that is a collaboration between the National Hispanic Cultural Center and the Center for Regional Studies. The Center for Regional Studies is dedicated to the creation of knowledge about New Mexico, the greater Southwest as a region, its connections to northern Mexico, Latin America, and Spain. The La Canoa Legacy Talks take their inspiration from the very word La Canoa, which can have several meanings. Here at the campus of the National Hispanic Cultural Center, we have a more modern rendition, an artistic rendition of La Canoa, which you can see to my right. The piece here reminds us, el agua es vida. We also want our talks to create knowledge, inspire action, bring practical and useful information to community members, specialized researchers, and others interested in the history, culture, sociology, politics, and religious experience of our region.
First of all, for those of you who aren't aware, I'm Ana Uremovich. I'm the archivist here at the National Hispanic Cultural Center. And it's my pleasure to kick off every La Canoa that we have for this season. We still have April, May, and June. And then we take a little rest, and then we kick it off again in the fall. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Michael Trujillo, Associate Professor of American Studies, Chicano-Mexicano Studies. He is our collaborator with the Center for Regional Studies from UNM that helps us not only bring the speakers here, but also to have copies in videotape for you to view at your leisure. Mike?
So, good afternoon. Thank you. I want to reiterate the welcome already extended by my colleague Ana Uremovich. As already mentioned, these events are co-sponsored by the National Hispanic Cultural Center and the University of New Mexico Center for Regional Studies. Ana and the NHEC and CRS staff do a great deal to make all these events happen. And I want to thank them for all that they do. So please give them a round of applause. The Canoa Legacy Talk Series features both academic and community research that considers both our region and our place in the world. Venerable UNM scholar and Nuevo Mexicano Jose Rivera defined a canoa as a hand-hewn flume cut out of a large log, designed to carry the water of the community, organized and governed ditches termed acequias, across an arroyo. In this way, canoas transport our traditional community's lifeblood and form an organic, integral, and integrating part of our landscapes, both human and natural. We take those hand-hewn and collectively constructive objects as the guiding metaphor for this speaker series. Like a canoa, we hope that these talks will serve our communities. We hope our canoa presenters speak about our region and our place in the world. We hope to provoke dialogue about the things important to us both here. So we want dialogue both here, but also following the presentation. We want our community to talk about these things more broadly, as they already do. This afternoon, I'm very excited to introduce my colleague, Moises Gonzales, of UNM's School of Architecture and Planning. He is an affiliate of UNM's Southwest Hispanic Research Institute as well, and that's one of the places that I often interact with him. He is the former director of the Resource Center for Raza Planning, and he is the current coordinator of the Bachelor of Arts in Environmental Planning and Design. He is a member of, and this may be more important to some people here, I know that he has friends and family here. He is a member of the Cañón de Carnuel land grant. Like his Nuevo Mexicano precursor, the anthropologist G. Benito Cordova, Moises is reclaiming the indigenous ancestry that is common to many of us. He is a Genízaro himself. Today's talk will be Genízaro, Ethnogenesis, Emergence, and Futurism. So please welcome Moises Gonzales.
So I brought some things because I'm going to talk about material culture. So I'm going to start with passing this rattle and this drum because these are abstract. The things that I'm talking about in terms of this culture aren't necessarily abstract things. And so what I want to do is I'm going to start with the mid-row. And so as I'm giving my talk, and you have any questions of what they are, these are things that are objects, or not just objects, that they're things that I'm going to talk about. So if you're wondering, there's a drum and a rattle from the Comanchitos dance. This is what we call, this is a cupil, which is the headdress from the Matachinas. So I'm going to pass this around, and you can just kind of pass this around. This is the palma on the locket, right? So what we dance with. And the reason is because when we talk about some of the things I'm going to discuss, is it's important to talk about aspects of material culture and identity that still exist that in terms of the context of scholarship and the context of who decides who people are and what their identity is. It's been quite a bit, it's been up for contention, especially among scholars in the 20th century, right? So the reason, so I'm talking, this talk is ethnogenesis, Genízaro ethnogenesis, emergence, and futurism. And I would argue that these concepts are actually related concepts, and they kind of reemerge through this identity of self-identity to this emergence and performance, and this projection of the future. They happen simultaneously, right? So with this image, I think this is a good image to start. This is, if you're ever familiar with the Matachinas, are making assumptions that people understand what the dance is. I'm actually going to interrogate what scholarships have done about the dance and offer it as identity. I mean, about how it can be representative as a future. But in terms of this dance, this was the Matachinas that was performed, I believe, in 2015. And in this, you have. You usually see the toro that's part of the dance. And the toro, if you've ever seen the dance, is engaged with the abuelo, and in some other villages there's a predilunia. So these are the clown folks, the clowns that are represented in the dance. In this one, you have a Comanchito, which is a little Comanche, and he has a green horn representing the horn of Cuerno Verde, who was the Comanche chieftain in the late 18th century, in which Fianza comes and there's a battle in Colorado. Then there's a peace accord between the Comanche-Ute alliance that allows trade to exist, right? And so in this dance, it's interesting that this particular danzante, this particular representation reminds us in the Matachinas at this particular time that this is an ephemeral conscious act remembering the Comanche traditions within New Mexico. This is in actually the village of Alcalde, where my wife's from. She just walked in. So I just want to mention that there's an upcoming book that several of us in this room have worked on. Michael has a chapter based on Benito's work. We have Mike Torres that's sitting up here working on a chapter on DNA. My primo in the back, David Garcia, Dr. Garcia, has a contribution in this book. So I just mentioned that because the book's actually called Genízaro Nation, Ethnogenesis, Place, and Identity. Right? So, so here's an image of Galeto from Alcalde. He got, and here he's represented with that same greenhorn. That in terms of, he died last October, and I think he's one of the persons that I think have perpetuated this idea of not just performance, but projecting a future of what identity is for Genízaros. So. In terms of, there's a lot of text, but don't pay attention to the text. I'll kind of go through it. This is because this presentation is also going to go online with the recording of this lecture, so it's kind of text heavy. So that way, those that can't see can go through the PowerPoint and understand. So in terms of Genízaro, one of the first folks that talked about Genízaros, at least in the 20th century, and it was one particular scholar was Fray Angelico Chavez. Fray Angelico Chavez comes out with a paper in 1979 in the Handbook of American Indians in the Southwest Edition. There was a specific segment on Genízaros where it's kind of, if you read that piece, it pretty much talks about that there was a Genízaros, and they lived in various settlements, and they lived across they were captives and adopted children, and that were raised with Hispanic families in the larger settlements of the Villa de Santa Cruz, the Villa de Abiquiu and Santa Fe. But then he goes on to say, when this became Mexico, Mexico was against slavery, and slavery never existed, and the Genízaros eventually were amalgamated and they were erased. In terms of the background of Benito was trained as an anthropologist. He studied under Edward Dozier, who was also an anthropologist. And he also, in terms of his scholarship, and I'm going to talk about the end of this talk, in terms he influenced a lot of folks like myself who were starting to grapple with concepts of identity and place and being connected to community, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So where do we get this concept of ethnogenesis? The term ethnogenesis is a creation of where a group of people at a point in time understand that they are a people, they are an identity, they share a collective. They share a collective cultural project, as you would say. So in New Mexico, when we look at ethnogenesis, one of the first documents that we start understanding who are the Genízaros of the 19th century, and just to explain a Genízaro was, usually it's referred to a captive or somebody that was captive into a Spanish family, or through a particular military campaign that was often raised within another group of Genízaros, or they were raised in a Hispanic family as a criada, a servant, or an indentured servant. In terms of where we get the first glimpse was a petition in 1733, and it's a petition by a group of Genízaros. What they do in this document, they're actually applying for a tract of land, which is the Sandia tract. This petition is denied because the governor and the priest at the time want to bring back the Tiwas and folks that were that had left after the Pueblo, after the reconquest, when de Vargas comes back, fled to Hopi. And they wanted to come back. So this priest was organizing to bring the Sandias back and actually eventually give a land grant at Sandia Pueblo. This petition was denied, and then subsequently some of the folks that were on this petition went on to settle Belen, and I'll talk a little bit about Belen, which is an important settlement. And then some of them stayed dispersed, but I think if you're interested in the title of the petition, it's called Los Genízaros que hayan disperso en la reina de la Nueva Mexico. So what they're saying is, of these folks, it's important to note that some of these folks are actually are called Genízaros in the document. Some of them are referred to Apaches, some of them Humanas, some of them are Panana. In fact, I'm a descendant of one particular, through my grandma's side, is a descendant of Diego Antonio Gurule. And so through this, there's actually 5 Pawnees that are part of this. So if we think about how far the Pawnees were and how they landed up in early 18th century New Mexico, it's pretty interesting. So in terms of generally the landscape of Genízaro settlements, or where Genízaros were, they were pretty much vast. But it's pretty much by the middle of the 18th century where Genízaros start getting spread throughout what is New Mexico. This is a map showing in terms of their placement. A lot of these settlements are specific because there's a particular governor, his name is Tomas Gachupin, and he becomes the architect of trying to move this large, vast amount of Genízaros into colonial society, where they're on a path to being civilized, right? So a lot of these folks come from Apache, Navajo, Comanche background. And so what I want you to look at this map is, if we look at kind of the period, you have, first is the Belen land grant. Then you have north to, like, in terms of Abiquiu, you have Los Ranchos, you have Las Trampas, San Miguel Elvado, Pueblo Quemado out towards Cordova, and Chimayo, in terms of what a lot of scholars refer to, Analco, which is at the edge of Santa Fe, Las Huertas and Carnue. And so what we start seeing is this, in terms of Tomas Gachupin, actually working through a process of giving land grants to Genízaros or partially Genízaro communities, in the sense to move them to a land base where they can move into colonial society, become good Catholics, and adopt farming and those kind of things. And so in terms of Tomas Gachupin, he pretty much takes on Genízaros as a project into becoming part of colonial society. And why is that important? Because a lot of scholars, if you look at kind of various scholars, you look at some of, at least Ramon Gutierrez's work, you look at Dr. Rael's work, what a lot of scholars pretty much use is this percentage between 28 and 33%. They account for, in terms by the end of the 18th century, about a third of the population. If you take Genízaros, Coyotes, or all the different folks that were categorized as servants or in servitude, it comes out to about 1/3 of the population. And so it comes mind-blowing where, when somebody takes a DNA test and they've kind of took the Spanish colonial myth heritage pill that their grandparents gave them, and they're like, how could I be 40% or half Native? Well, it's like, because, I'll go into that about, kind of the politics of identity, right? So one of the first, in terms of what, I'm going to just kind of highlight a couple communities and then talk a little bit about my own, is when we talk about places, Abiquiu becomes a very important place when we talk about Genízaro identity. Because in terms of, unlike, say, where I'm from, Carnuel and area de las Huertas, or places like Alcalde, there were a lot of Genízaros, along with folks that were mixed, and then they became kind of amalgamized into kind of like a community population. Whereas places like Abiquiu and Belen were specifically Genízaro projects. So just like the Sandia project, Abiquiu in 1754 lands up being a project, again, a similar example of Tomas Gachupin, where he moves 14 Hopi, Tano, Tewa. I mean, everybody kind of slices hairs as scholars in terms of how these groups are identified, but they were basically from the village of Hano that were moved back to Abiquiu to settle. They wanted to come back. Then at that time, then it becomes a place where, in terms of where Comanches are being brought in, Utes are being brought in and being brought into the community. So in terms of, this is just looking at Harrington's work, who wrote the ethnography of the Tewa Indians. He basically starts interviewing a lot of folks, a lot of Tewa people into the turn of the century, and he starts identifying like that Abiquiu is really connected to the Tewa people and has a relationship. What's important about cultural performance is that if you listen, and the reason I say if you listen to some scholars, like even Harrington and even
some of the anthropologists of the early 20th century, they were trying to create the three, people argue the tricultural myth, right? You had the Spanish, then you had this nice category of the Pueblos, and then you had the Anglo-American frontiersmen. So it creates this kind of like this narrative, but no one somehow kind of ignores kind of the messiness of what was going on in terms of identities in the in-between space, right? So here's a picture of Abiquiu from this last November, and it's from the dances of Santo Tomas. And so what those scholars aren't connected, they're not connecting in terms of how performance culture and material culture, and that's the reason I'm passing around some of those things, because I myself made my cupid when I danced the matachines, right? I had a family friend make the palma, so it's in terms of how materials are produced and how they relate to performance and how they start characterizing our identity, it encapsulates beyond what history books have been able, or in terms of what primarily Anglo 20th century scholars, or even scholars like Fray Angelico Chavez were able to accomplish, because again, according to Fray Angelico Chavez, we were genízaros had disappeared and they had already mixed into the broader population. Where if we look, this is a map of a project of some students that I work were mapping out in terms of traditional space within Abiquiu. These communities still exist within a management structure, not only of acequias, of land, within a collective process that we call querencia, right? If you hear the term querencia, it's these related community practices that we encapsulate. So now I'm going to kind of move along and talk a little bit about my community and about how Carnuel and Placitas were pretty much Genízaro projects of the Rio Abajo. And the reason, if you look at this map, this is the Mira y Pacheco map from 1779, I believe. And if you look at this map, you have all the settlements of the Rio Grande Valley, but then you can see how you have Las Huertas, and then you have Carnuel. And in this map, it's kind of interesting how you kind of read the map. It's basically, you can read that in this period, Pacheco is calling the eastern New Mexico plains the frontera y entrada de los enemigos Comanches, right? So basically, if you ever go out to Edgewood, we forget that that's the edge of the Comancheria, the edge of the frontier. And interesting enough, what were the three most kind of passageways that were able to get enter the Rio Abajo was through either the Diablo Pass, where the Salinas missions were, the Cañón de Carnuel, which is basically Tijeras Canyon, and north of Placitas and Las Huertas, which is basically that area. So just like Abiquiu, Tomás Vélez Gachupin in 1763 actually calls for, organizes some folks that want to go out there, and they settle in Carnuel. And then in 1767, Tomás Vélez Gachupin also tries to settle Las Huertas. So if you look at it, this kind of gives you just the terrain. It's my background's in urban design, so I have to do a map. Can't just do a map. You got to do it in 3D, right? So anyway, if you look at an aerial view of where the Cañón de Carnuel, it's basically a tight canyon. It basically, if you think about it today, it basically fits. I-40, Old 66, and then the Carnuel Langrat lands around it. So it's a tight canyon. So I kind of put the analogy that it's always been a highway, right? So if you look at I-40, before that was just a Comanche highway, right? In terms of the village. So in terms of understanding, in terms of the narratives, I think there's some great narratives that we have to look at, and that we can actually look in terms of the colonial record. But let's face it, these were priests that were writing things, or they were Spanish administrators that were writing about. And so you see a lot of information in the archives. So this is the archives, and I'm going to give an example of one particular family, and this is the census record from 1750 of Antonio Gouroulet. Well, Antonio Gouroulet was the son of the French guy, I guess, that came back with the folks from de Vargas, Antonio Grolet. He marries Elena Gallego. She lands up being, has the Elena land grant, which is basically the North Valley. They have one son. But what I think interesting about this document is that if you go into, she had two servants. Antonio Gouroulet had two servants, and he had one was Rosa and one was Bernardina. What's interesting, if you track the lives of the servants, most of these kids most of their children land up forming the Carnuez settlement, and a lot of them land up forming Las Huertas, and then land up all over. Some of them land as far as Ojo Caliente, and so even if we start and take an origin of a family like the Gouroulet, it's kind of interesting that if you take that particular family, most of the descendants that are Gouroulet today don't even realize that, or they may or may not realize that most of them actually come from the two criadas. And then some of them land up popping out, like you can't see this, but this is just a record of Salvador Gouroulet, who's the son of the Juan Antonio Gouroulet, who's Pawnee, who lands up being very important in terms of the survival of the Las Huertas land grant. This is just his marriage record where he married, and it's interesting because he's died in his first marriage. He was married twice, first in Santa Fe, and then the second time in La Cienega. The first time he's listed as an Indian, the second time he's listed as Coyote. I've tracked certain records where a person in colonial New Mexico, based on how assimilated they were perceived, in colonial New Mexico, you could really be born a genízaro, marry and be a mestizo, and die a Spaniard. So, that's Mike's shaking his head. You've seen that, right? And we know this because if we track some of these folks, like for example, Salvador Gouroulet, he was basically lands up in so he's basically kind of wandering around in the 1750s. By the 1740s, by the 1750s, he settled in Los Ranchos. By the time he's old, this is the 1802 census, military census of Las Huertas. So if you look at the military census, they're interesting for New Mexico in the colonial period because you'll usually find the folks that are most warm or most armed are also the most wealthy. They have so many horses, they have so many mules, they have escopetas, which is a flintlock, basically shotgun, which is very hard, you're well off if you have that. So in the start of the census, you start so we see Salvador's census, he has an escopeta, a lance, he has two caballos, and then some of them have mules. But if you track and you go down to the end of Las Huertas of kind of like folks, I have another descendant of the Gutierrez that I'm descendant of. My descendant lower on the list just has a flecha. So you go, basically that's it. They're defending themselves with bow and arrow. So if you look at how, in terms of how some of these folks had agency, they go on, they settle on land grants, and they, they kind of evolve. That's what I think is important about these stories because, again, as scholarship evolves, it's important. I think one of the missing things is me as a dude that we really need to kind of take on is in these narratives. There's a lot of female narratives that I think that there's these are also sites, these archives for I think really interesting critical Genízaro feminist analysis that's going that I think that it's going to evolve in this work. So I think then we move on. So now becomes now we're in the early 20th century, and I think it's interesting to look at kind of the work of Francis Soares, who also was publishing in kind of like the same period. So I look at like the folks that are influencing the ideas of Genízaros. You have Benito Cordova, who's taking it on as within his position within Abiquiu as a Genízaro and a Genízaro scholar. Then you have Fray Angelico Chavez, who has his own project, right? He's creating Spanish American identity, right? So he's kind of has his own project going on. And then you have Frances Soares, who's also writing and coming up. She's doing a lot of work in Abiquiu. She's an archaeologist and an anthropologist, and lands up working on a lot of important archaeology projects. And then she lands up being the main anthropologist that's involved in the excavations of the old Carnué and San Antonio sites. So she's actually going in, and then so then if you read her book, The Ute Frontier, a lot of the things that she's talking about are these exchanges and flows amongst people between the Utes, the Navajo, the Apache, and communities in New Mexico. So that's a great book, you know. So what's interesting about, in terms about when we look at, let's go back to interrogating maybe the work of Fray Angelico Chavez. In fact, some scholars argue that the word genízaro falls off the radar, and because the priest stopped using it, and to some degree it did happen. What Frances Soares and other scholars were looking at the time, especially her, she said, well, what happened after this, when Mexican independence, is the Mexican state in New Mexico was pretty unorganized. The Spanish were regulating buffalo hunts, and they were regulating slave markets, where in the Mexican period, slave markets were pretty much unregulated. What that meant for communities in like Las Huertas and San Antonio and a lot of the out by Abiquiu, basically what it was is people were able to, and so I'm going to read this quote from Soares. She says, the growth of San Antonio is linked with the industries that brought residents, also that caused San Antonio residents to be absent for lesser stretches of time. From the beginning, men customary were absent for months at a time, hunting buffalo and trading on the plains. This is very characteristic of some of the dance performances that we do and some of the oral histories that we're taught. The reason is this important period because in the East Mountain, the men were leaving in October and they weren't coming back till Christmas, and they were out hunting buffalo, and when they came back they were bringing tons of servants back and tons and actually priming the slave markets of the middle Rio Grande Valley. I mean, so that's, and not just here, it was happening throughout New Mexico. And this oral history transcends. It wasn't just in terms of the written record of what Frances Soares was finding in terms of the evidence. In terms of Adelia Garcia, she contributed to an oral history project in the East Mountain. I find her statement very interesting. I'm going to read from her oral interview. She says that the San Antonio fiestas were originally in December. In the earliest days where there were only matachinas in San Antonio, and they danced in the snow. The leader used to wear moccasins that he made himself. This is pretty interesting because in modern times, I danced the San Antonio Fiesta, but that's in June, right? June 12th. So even think of like the alignment of the calendars of how calendars and feast days happen. They're not like what we think they happen, right? So, and in terms of understanding the material culture, it's important to place events with economy, with kind of how traditions happen. There's a lot of great narratives that exist. One in particular is the Lou Batchen. There were historians that were hired in the WPA period that went out to all parts of northern New Mexico. They were interviewing people. One in particular set is through Placitas and La Madera and out by San Pedro, New Mexico, which is basically the northeast segment of the Sandia Mountains. And basically, what's interesting there, because we think about like how the early U.S. soldiers were probably confronting buffalo hunters. Nuevo Mexicano buffalo hunters, probably different what they think, of course, like what Bandelier was saying about this idea, this binary of this, the Spanish and the Indian, because what we're finding out is that even the U.S. government and the Texas Rangers were very confused as to who was Comanche, who was Hispano Nuevo Mexicano, and because these blared cultural attributes were very blurred. Many buffalo hunters spoke Comanche, they spoke Apache, and many Comanche spoke Spanish as well, right? So, so just looking at the material culture that we know, this is from the Lou Batchin oral history. She interviewed Jose Livrado Gurule from Placitas in 1939. So he's remembering when he was remembering what the older folks were saying when he was a kid. He said there were few buffalo hunts after 1865. Many of them during the 50s. Men from Ojo de las Casas, Placitas, La Madera, Tejon, Algodones, and Bernalillo would make up a hunting party sent out for the Llano Estacado. Then he goes on to the next saying that they would make everything out of the buffalo. Buttons, moccasins, loincloths, right? And we forget, in terms of production, we forget that Genízaros actually produced pottery, right? We don't really talk about that much. There's very significant types of pottery that have been lost that people just don't know how to do. In Abiquiu, there are still some potters. We just lost, ¿cómo se llama? En Ojo Caliente, a year or two ago. What was the name? Yeah, Felipe Ortega. I don't know if any of you are familiar with his style of pottery. Well, this is a chard that's found all over. In fact, I found it, you find it everywhere in Conway. It's called a conweware, and it's basically a micaceous type of pottery that was produced, right? For time, I'm just going to kind of move through some of these slides. Then the Americans come, right? And then then there's this whole project. And the project is, one is, so if we look at the kind of changes in identity and the changes of relationships, a lot of that came through the forced settlement of the Comanche, the Apache, the Ute, just to name a few people, right? Because if you have these flows of Comanche buffalo hunters that are exchanging, and yes, they brought children back, and that was probably a bad thing. But in this exchange, what you had is basically the extraction of the land and the resources in terms of how the land grants were adjudicated. You also had, in terms of the forced removal of folks. In terms of the land grant, the Conway land grant, in terms of as we reach the 19th century, the 20th century, finally in 1901, we get a patent. And we were in court for quite a long time, from the 1860s to 40 plus years. By the time we get the patent in 1903, the land grant shrunk from 90,000 acres to 2,000 acres, right? So it's really interesting that the families still have a connection. And a lot of things are disrupted, right? This is kind of a diagram that would show probably around cultural life throughout the calendar year. So here you have January, March, July. And so talking about like the winter months, what were folks doing after they'd come back from the buffalo hunts? There were a lot of artisan guilds, and so guilds were doing certain type of things in terms of in those winter months. Then you had the planting season, the irrigation and planting, fixing the acequia, moving into different various days like Semana Santa and the Lenten area, moving out of that into planting season, and then moving into like San Miguel when folks, after that, it's pretty well known that that's when they would go on the buffalo hunts until they would come back during the posadas at Christmas. One of the things that I think that's problematic for Genízaro communities or New Mexicans as a whole is when we had this is a diagram showing the social relationships within, say, the Cañón de Conway land grant. And it has the systems of the water, the acequias, the hermanos, the carmelitas. The carmelitas were basically a cofradia in terms of managing the social systems. And here is all the physical systems. So you have the leadership systems. You have even in terms of other folks that are important, like mayordomos, danzantes, curanderas, parciantes, artisan guilds, and how they all manage this land. So this is a pretty complex system that were kind of erupted in terms of not just in terms of the period of adjudications and how water is treated in New Mexico and moving towards being used as a commodity. What it does is these breakages in these systems starts affecting our cultural memory, right? And then we start saying, and then so you go 2-3 generations, you get folks that participated in a system like this, they're far removed after 3-4 generations. Then, and I guess we'll talk about that at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center on Wednesday. I'll talk a little bit about that. Is this, now people are really struggling with what it means to be Nuevo Mexicano, because we don't have that system of how herencias pass between maybe a Carmelita into, between women that have, that handled pretty complex aspects of society. For example, when a woman, elderly woman died, how were her, or a young woman died, how would her children be taken care of? There was a whole complex of how children would move and be raised in the community. So we had, before there was welfare or social networks, right? We had carencia. I'm going to move on to performance, right? So we have dances, right? And like the matachines that identify in terms of how our performance is handled. Now I'm going to move into continuing along this concept of emergence. So if ethnogenesis was within the 19th century, it somehow got blurred by the time the American period came, because the disconnection of land, the modernization. By the time we get to World War II, we have a fading memory, except for maybe in communities where cultural performance and this idea of self-reflection of identity is still performed, right? I'm pointing this because this is a great book. It's actually one of my colleagues is Bernardo Gallegos. He just wrote a book. It's called PostColonial Indigenous Performances. He was also very involved, along with Dr. Rael Galvez, in terms of ushering in a memorial. I don't know if you're familiar. In 2008, there was a memorial passed by the state legislature that actually recognized Genízaro for its first time in history. It's pretty monumental, and saying that, there were these people, they existed in this area, and they were in these communities, and guess what? They weren't even that communities. Some of them were adopted by wealthy Hispanic families, and they're probably everywhere. And you were probably, if you're a descendant of somebody that lived in colonial New Mexico, you're probably a descendant of one of them, right? Just if you and what's important about this is that the state has to reconcile this history. It hasn't since come back to this, but it's pretty important. Bernardo talks a lot about the importance in his book. So what we talk about in terms of this emergence, it's not resolved. It's an identity that's still in conflict, and it's going through this production. I'll get into futurism in terms of this cycle, right? And how it kind of pops up is this is if you don't, last year, right before Christmas, not last year, the year before, so this came out in December 2016, we had a story by the NPR that really kind of delved into how is this, in this pocket of New Mexico, how is the Genízaro identity still being imagined and produced, right? And we have conscious acts of what Genízaro means in terms of how our relationships are being forged. This is Linda Gutierrez. She's a woman from Conway. She's on the Conway Land Grant Board. She's also a veteran. So when Standing Rock was going down, and there was a call because it was getting pretty violent, and there were a group of New Mexicans that were of Native men that were going out from the different pueblos, and also from the Navajo Nation we're going to go out to. She made a phone call, and she goes, I have to go. And she went down to Isleta. She got on the bus, and she stayed. After some conversation, they're like, you're from where and what? And she landed up being on the bus. And then since she's been back, she's forged new relationships with veterans in Isleta, which is kind of ironic, because, not ironic, it's kind of this in terms of relationships, because if you go to the earliest women in Conway and Las Huertas, there's evidence that they were connected through genealogies to women that were marrying originally Genízaro men in Conway. So there's also that connection, right? So now let's talk about this competing, where, the complexities of, scholars call it like hegemonic forces or counter-hegemonic forces, right? But I'm not going to kind of use those words right now because they make. But so now we come, and this is an image of what? This is the Española fiesta, right? And this is the performance of the Oñate and the pageantry of La Reina, right? Where there's this conscious effort of playing out a Spanish identity. Well, if we look at where, in terms of what scholars were doing, and not just scholars, in terms of what folks were trying to do to even allow us to make a state. It's not my work, but it's the work of other people, right? But if you look at some of what other scholars talk about, in terms of what was problematic about New Mexico is we were too many Mexicans here to become a state. So they started switching the script, because even if you go to the record of when we became a state, it was in terms of the arguments that were made, they were like, well, they're not just Mexicans, they're sons of the conquistadors. And then that gets wrapped up into tourism, right? Because there's great tourism if you create, in terms of Santa Fe, in terms of fantasy heritage. That starts playing out in terms of the pageantry of the fiesta. So let's talk about how the de Vargas, do you guys know how the de Vargas, in terms of the play, how it was created? Basically, there were scholars from SAR, the School of American Archaeology. They actually wrote a script in which Hispanos at the time, that's even a created word, right? Because we're not Mexican enough, so we create, we got to create this word of whiteness, right? So then they create this script. And so you go into the 1920s and 1930s, and so it kind of emerges, and everybody thinks, wow, this is a cultural event. It's like, nah, dude, it's like some scholar wrote, and people just started performing this, right? And so now we think that's what identity is. Then guess what? The businessmen in Española who were at the time in the 30s were pretty much Anglo city council members. They start saying, wow, we got to compete with Santa Fe, so let's create the Oñate fiestas. And guess what? They create this whole this place about Oñate, and guess what? Fast forward, people get in fights in Española if you say, like, I was Oñate one time. I'm proud of that, right? And so that becomes how it plays out. So in terms of how we start now, fast forward, now in terms of, where the future of identity is going, because I get questions all the time. They're saying, well, do genízaros want to breathe the new nation? I'm like, man, just hold on. We're just trying to figure out our placement our place within these created identities. Let us figure our relationships out, And so I'm going to read something from, I'm about done, but I know, I want to make sure we have engaged conversation. But I want to read a quote from Pekka's book. He wrote the book Comanche Empire, right? So I want to just have you kind of think about this. He's talking about how genízaros play out their identity in modern times. To subvert such Anglo-American construction of stigmatized racial mixing of impurity, many New Mexicans have attempted to reclaim themselves as Spanish identity. Groups of New Mexican mestizos who link their links to historically Genízaro communities have actively embraced the hybridity of the Comancheria and the Apacheria, those vast cultural territories beyond the control of colonial authorities. They have memorialized their connections in expressive culture, clothing, and oral traditions, and they reenact those linkages in popular and local performances of Los Comanches. In doing so, they disassociate themselves from the privileged coalition of Anglo-Spanish Americans. They undermine the hegemonic pretensions of that coalition and promote a distinctive Chicano consciousness that traces its roots to the ethnic melting pot that was Comancheria. So what seems to be done is actually a conscious act. I would say that when we saw the first slide, by putting the torito as a Comanche as a conscious act, performance of not just reemergence, but perpetuating a contradictive narrative, right? And these narratives have played out for a long time. So if we now to think about in terms of this, so if we're talking about these counter narratives, they're going to play out, and they're going to start playing out much more contentiously or non-contentiously. I think last year the Santa Fe Fiestas was emblematic of the contention, right? So here's a painting from the 17th, from the 19th century, and it's actually at Denver Art Museum. You can actually go see it. And it's called Genízaro Mulata. And so if you think about all the cast paintings, they're pretty interesting because they have, you know, the Español and then the Mestizo. And so we have 16 to 20 categories of whiteness, and all the way to the bottom is the Genízaro Bávaro. The Indio Bávaro. That's the worst because they have no soul. They have no consciousness, and they can't even enter, you know, civilized society. The next lowest one is the Genízaro, right? Because the Genízaro is still in this process of moving towards whiteness. So in these paintings, you'll find about how Spanish colonial painters were even getting folks that weren't literate to be able to see, like, my goal is for whiteness. My family needs to move into being civil and being civilized. And so if you look at the way this is portrayed, this means like the Genízaro's drunk on the streets of Santa Fe. He's married to a mulata, and that poor kid, you know, the dad's drunk all the time, and there's obviously no civility or no future in that. Where if you look at in this painting, it's called the Chino India Genízaro. And here you have a Genízaro who actually married a Chino who's from another racial classification, but somehow, you know, as you move up, you're moving into whiteness, and so that's a much better way of life than that, right? So, you know, how do we think about that? So if you've ever, I'm kind of going to move on in terms of how some things folks are perpetuating in the future. Just a couple more things. This is a book by Big Dreams and Dark Secrets in Chimayo. Just to raise a hand if folks who've read this. Yeah, it's pretty cool. Yeah, David is, and I'm sure we all have our different kind of interpretations. But the main character of Salvador is a very interesting character, right? Because in the whole story of his life, he takes, so Benito, who I think is taking this work, Benito moves into, like, in terms of this novel, I think what he's taking is perpetuating a future of how the common Nuevo Mexicano is lacking consciousness of our identity. And so what he's doing is he's taking places of characters, and I used to hang out with Benito when he was writing, and I didn't even understand it because I wanted to talk about his past work and he wanted to talk about his current work. And so, and then we'd spend time on hiking the hills of Jemez because he was always trying to find these Apacheria camps, and you know, so we'd spend a lot of time there in the Jemez talking about a lot of the stuff. But in terms of what he thought that, in terms of conversation that we had, is that that Genízaros, in terms of this loss of understanding, led to a lot of other problems, right? And it leads to us having a lack of consciousness and lack of connection. Benito was really deep about his understanding and knowledge of Chimayo too, in terms of, you know, in terms of his. So what he does in this novel, he takes characters that I'm sure he knows and characters that that he reflects on, and they're positioned in between Chimayo and Abiquiu. And moving into the real, the surreal. But what's interesting is he places the main character in a nutshell is Salvador. And Sal, he lands up going through this process of kind of living this lifestyle, but at the point of in death, he's living and has this connection to his identity, right? And so I think of that projecting in terms of as a future. I think what the way I interpret that is the importance of in terms of how we connect to place and identity. One of the things I want to do is I'm going to point to another work that I think is important is Cleophas Vigil in this song that was written in 1981. He's describing, it's called Himno del Pueblo de las Montañas del Sangre de Cristo. And he's actually using the word Genízaro in this, and he's actually himself taking himself in a connection of this history connected to place, and actually reflects on his indigeneity. So I'm going to play this just so you can hear some of this.
cambiaron sus creencias. Y hermosas indias morenas. Qué indias hermosas, virtuosa llena de gracia. Escogieron para esposa, donde nació linda raza.
The video is funky. It kind of shows like Los Alamos, and I don't know who put the video together, but you should go online and check it out.
Color bronce de mestizo, mezcla del indio del pueblo, donde salió un genízaro.
There it is. So I just want to kind of continue on. So I kind of like wanted to have some fun, right? So like, what if, as we keep on saying our future, right? We have a census coming up. So that's my cousin's granddaughter, and she dances for us with the Comanchitos. And I thought, like, we could project these futures in every way, right? They can be contested, and that's what I'm playing. Like, you always see those census ads, like stand and be counted, so that's what I'm kind of playing here, right? So here's a little genízaro. It shows genízaro stand and be counted, right? United States Census 2020. I mean, what if we put this, and there's 2,000 people that claim genízaro identity in the next census, and so it's, and here's one that I played with the Abiquiu, right? So this is kind of after one of their dances. And the reason I'm going to end with this is because if you look at the Matachinas, a lot of people have written about the Matachinas in different ways, but the Matachinas is, in terms of the way I look at it, is I'm analyzing this painting. This is a painting from 1680. This paintings of the Metote or Danza los Montezuma or Matachinas that come in a similar, have similar origins. Well, here in this quote, so the painting's called Indian Wedding and Pole Dancers. So you see the pole dancers. And then, so here depicted as an Indian couple, they're getting married. The Donce Montezuma or the Matachinas are dancing in the front. And so you could see like it's organized. This is an organized colonial landscape. So this painting was probably kind of transmission back to Spain, like, the colonial project is a success, it's working, right? And so we look at the Matachinas as how it was transformed. In a lot of communities where it was transformed, people don't really understand that sometimes that the Matachinas were the only really dance that indigenous communities could actually do. And the reason is because it professed a way of teaching Catholicism to indigenous people. But in that, so one interpretation is that the Malinche is leading Montezuma and his capitanes into accepting Jesus, Catholicism. But there's a dual message in there, right? Because when I've danced the Matachinas, I'm looking at the nuances, and I think embedded is just the opposite. Like, the colonial project isn't over, and it's still in contestation. So you could also look at the Matachinas and say, Malinche is going to lead them back to indigeneity, and it's not over. So with that, thank you.
Questions?
origin for a generation or so?
Yeah, that's the thing, and all these customs are very complex because you have a mix like these hybridities, and that's why Bernardo in his book goes really into breaking down practice, performance, and hybridity, right? Because if you go to the Comanches, like when we dance the Comanchitos, it's actually what happens is when they come back from the buffalo hunt, it happens around various communities in New Mexico. There's actually verses that go into the Comanchitos where there's a dance to Santo Niño, and the Comanche, and so those that are bringing in captives have an obligation to raise them into and accept them into the family. But at the same thing, it's an initiation dance into the community to Santo Niño. So in these nuances, we get in these arguments all the time with different, in terms of different interpretations with some scholars that I would argue that Genízaro culture is a totally hybrid space that exists within Catholicism and indigeneity.
Well, you spoke of slavery. When slavery was abolished, they become servants and then went on and be slaves for a while?
No, that's the difference between maybe like say English Anglo-American slavery and maybe Spanish-American slavery. Not to say anyone's better, I'm not saying, but the difference is that folks within a generation or two, within that first generation, if a criada came in or a servant at a young age, they were adopted in the family and landed up being part of that family. So that's why when people come from this a Spanish elite family, and they're like, Mike Torres probably gets it all the time because he's with the DNA Project. They're like, well, why am I was pure Spanish. I had so many, all our family came from the noble family, the families of Santa Fe. It's like, wow, you probably had a bunch of servants that were adopted in the family and landed up being brought in. So that's why within families, within spaces of Santa Cruz, and in Albuquerque, you have, if you fast forward, the Spanish elites, they were the ones that were bringing in slaves because they actually had to have help with maintaining large parcels of farmland.
Moises, thank you for the topic. Also, thank you for the work you do on it.
Thank you.
But now I can explain to folks my heritage coming from mestizos and genízaros and how I ended up being pure Spanish. But I do have one question, and that is, you talk about the different viewpoints, I guess. Enrique Lamadrid, Miguel Gander, and other folks have also talked about genízaros. Where are those connecting? What's the nexus?
Well, actually, that's our anthology because we actually, Genízaro Nation it's under peer review. We've gotten our first reviews back. We're waiting to, so hopefully we'll go through all the process and each chapter in that anthology. Everybody has a different perspective. I think what it does is it talks about different narratives from different perspectives we have a woman from Virginia Sanchez contributing. She's from Southern Colorado, talking about how many youths were brought into the Hispano families in Colorado. And we talk about performance culture. We talk DNA. We talk scholarship and literary analysis in terms of Michael work. What I think this is a survey that actually gets us all to think that whether you grew up in it as a Genízaro or you never understood it, you could read this and somehow place yourself as a Nuevo Mexicano in terms of an understanding of relationships and identity that has pretty much been it hasn't been talked about and it's been uncovered in what we'd like to think, and I'm going to use Bernardo's words. We're actually uncovering, it's a burial, right? We're uncovering a burial. And we're kind of like confronting this and coming to terms with that, and that's where in terms of where the re-emergence comes. I'll go Michael and then here.
Well, I think this follows from that. So this is a term which I don't recall people calling themselves 30, 40 years ago.
Absolutely,
In
no.
colonial era, it was a term that people said, it was a thing that people called people, and it was also a thing people said, that's who I am.
Yeah.
When I remember 30, 40 years ago, it was a thing you said about other people.
Yes.
Right? But in Benito Cordova, it says, was saying 30 years ago, not only this is who I am, this is who you are. And I feel like you're doing some of that same work. And this is an argument with Angelico Chavez, who not only did these people disappear, but he said, oh, but those are also their descendants are the ones who now call themselves Chicanos, right? And identify with Mexicans, as opposed to being Spaniards. So I think you are in a polemic with Angelico Chavez and Espinosa, right? And I don't know, but myself, I'm suspecting that when you're talking about this, then you're not only saying, I think you are, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying this is who I am, and you're also looking out at the audience saying, this is who you may be as well. In fact, you probably are, if you think about it. So if this is a term people weren't calling themselves 30 years ago, why is it emerging now at this moment? Is it something that is percolating out in the community? Is it because people like you and Benito Cordova were talking about it? Is there something about this moment in history which makes people, because now I am hearing people saying, this is who I am.
So I'm going to just quick story about my grandpa, and then I'll talk a bit about, kind of how that. So my grandpa Moises, we have cousins there. My grandpa Moises always, I just remember when I was a kid, my cousin Julian came to the house, and I always tell the story how I kind of remember growing up. Like he would say, after lunch, he'd say, oh yeah, we were. In our family, we were Comanches, and then we became Apaches, and they used to go hunt the buffalo, and then they would go hunt the buffalo for months and bring back kids. And I just thought it was crazy. I thought that was like, that couldn't happen. That's not. And so my grandpa was very proud of his Apache and Pickery, okay? Pickeries, that's Pickery, and then in that background. And no, my grandpa was always, he referred to himself as being of indigenous background, but he didn't use the word Genízaro. It wasn't his existence. A lot of folks in the East Mountain, like even in terms of work of Soares, she found out in her work that everybody would somehow finally refer to them that they came from Apaches. And she talks about that, and so does. So no, it's not a popular word. When I confronted it, I was actually going through work going through documents in the Conway land grant and my own genealogy. It kept on popping up. And so I read Benito's, and then I landed up living in Rio Arriba, so I started hanging out with Benito, and Benito would talk about it, not just from a cultural standpoint. So then what I think it does is now how the scholarship's going, and that's why I think it's a futurism. It's taking something where you're seen as going, nowhere drunk, that as perceived at the outside, because what Michael's talking about is the only remembrance of the word in New Mexico is vernacular. When someone would tell you, like an adult would tell a kid, "No seas genízaro." Don't act like you're out of control, like you're acting like a wild one, or calling somebody like they're. Like she calls me a mountain, my wife calls me a mountain man, but I mean, they would use that, like, no seas genízaro, right? So what I think people, in terms of where it is now, it's taking that concept of Spanish American, and it's throwing, and so if mestizo is somewhere in there, or Chicana or Chicano from a New Mexico standpoint, the idea is to reconstitute it as a total binary conflict of Spanish or Hispano. Right, and then it comes along with that is like almost, a political, kind of, I'd say it's a politicization of the identity for me, because that's what it's kind of it's becoming. Like, no, I didn't cross the border, cross me. In fact, since we have to talk about our current politics. I've been on I remember telling my wife, I responded on a blog on the Journal, and somebody said, just because my name was Moises Gonzales, go back to Mexico. That's the understanding, because now we have nativist, right? The idea is like Trump's a nativist, and if you go back to several generations, I guess back east, now they co-opt the term nativist. So I think the term Genízaro says, you know what? I go back to this land, and I'm not, you know, and yes, there was a bloody conquest. I'm a product of that, but emerge that is, just like Pekka said, you know, he calls it the counter hegemony of Spanish identity, the Spanish identity coalition of the wealthy Hispanos and the wealthy Anglos that were organizing, which is, let's face it, has been the organizing political framework of New Mexico. So I think I had a question here, and then I'll come back. So actually my primo then, and then I'll come here and then there.
I recognize, the tall guy I know is your great-grandfather.
Yeah.
I assume that the person in the center is your dad,
Yes.
and the female is your great-grandmother, Abiquiu.
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah.
Because the first time I saw this picture, surprisingly, was on Facebook with your...
Yeah, so the reason I put this is because Avelina, actually her maternal group goes back to Isleta Pueblo. It's pretty like connect. And then my grandpa, his mom was Santana. Yeah, Native American, right? She was the last in our current memory, or in our family, she was the last adopted indigenous person into the family, or married into, right?
I've heard other stories, but yes.
Did some of the genízaros, did they become landholders eventually, you know, living with the Spanish family or something like that?
Different stages, right? So, Abiquiu was like a project, right? Carnuel was a bunch of probably pobre mestizos that didn't have land, and genízaros. So they they set up Las Huertas and that, and then they landed up bringing about a bunch of Apaches and all that. So then that landed up being something else. Then you had, so it's all over. So then you had wealthy families that had servants. So there's a variety of ways in which folks acquired land. The contract under Tomas Vez Gachupin is if you genízaros go settle a settlement, you'll be able eventually you'll have those lands, and you'll acquire lands.
Over time.
Yeah, and so it's a combination of, then you get a land, and guess what? You get a parish priest, and then you start, you know, acting civilized, right? Let's go here and then here.
I understand today they could take DNA in your blood and tell you what your ancestry was. Indian, Chinese, Welsh, Negro, etc.
So what we're going to do is, there's a continuous, it's not going to be on this, but Mike, Miguel, and then Gregorio Gonzales, myself, and are going to be on a panel where we're exploring like what is Native American DNA, and that's going to be in the Pueblo Cultural Center on Wednesday. So let's go here.
You know the name Francisco Gonzales el Comanche?
Yeah.
Is he still?
In fact, I had a picture of him. I don't know. I thought it was on here. Yeah, he comes to Carnuel all the time, and in fact, he's one that's now thinking about how, you know, he's El Comanche from Taos is connected to the Comanches out of Rancho de Taos. In fact, so he's very active. He participates in his community and his dances. His grandson just finished his dissertation. He's also going to be one of the speakers that's speaking with us on Wednesday. So Comanche's grandson will be speaking on that. And so Comanche is very active in a lot of, I would say, genízaro in terms of performance culture.
He was with all the Chicanos and Highlands.
Mm-hmm. Yes, with mm-hmm.
All those people, but he was always a Comanche, but he never really got into, he really talked a whole lot.
In fact, I had pictures of him. I just kind of made some slides. So you can go, he's Googleable. You Google El Comanche and seeing him sing Comanche songs. It's pretty much assumed that when De Vargas comes back, and you go to the pueblos, and there's the Canes, and there's a lot of other scholars that can like jump on that if you want to jump on that. But they were already pretty much accepted as Pueblo holdings since the governors. So De Vargas, I would assume that when he came back, those lands were already recognized. The only two pueblos that were recognized differently through a different process was Sandia Pueblo, because it was a resettlement project, and Abiquiu. So I don't know if you want to add something to it.
Like Casa Colorada or other like Genízaro pueblos that applied and were rejected. Like Abiquiu is the only one in New Mexico that was approved.
No, there was other ones. There's different variations. It gets really complex because like every situation is different. For example, the Martin Serrano land grants, which is the land grant in Alcalde, New Mexico, that was Serrano Martin, but he had to bring a bunch of Genízaros there to help him to actually settle it. The same with Embudo. There's ways in which Genízaros are moving through settlements for various reasons. I don't know if you want to add something.
No, I think we're hitting the end of our time.
Okay. All right.
So as you heard, there's going to be a talk on Wednesday. Say it again.
The Indian Pueblo Cultural Center, 5:30.
And one of the things I planned on mentioning at the beginning, and if you didn't get off Gonzales right now, there is going to be more. There's more on Wednesday. In addition, there was the New York Times article.
Yes.
So this conversation, this issue, it has great resonance. It is something that is of national interest. So it's not only of interest here, it's interest across the nation. It's one of the ways that people around the nation are interested in us. So are there anything else that you want to leave us with?
No.
Okay, he's going to be here, so if your questions weren't answered, please come up and talk to him now. And thank you very much for coming.
Thank you all.